Part 1. I still remember the exact smell before I remember the argument. It wasn't fresh-cut hay, damp cedar, or the creek that always ran behind my south pasture. It was raw sewage, thick enough to burn your throat before you even saw where it was coming from. And standing beside that filthy water was a developer wearing polished boots that had never touched real mud, smiling at me like he'd already won. My name is Caleb Mercer, and my family has worked the same 40-acre ranch outside Redstone Valley for almost 70 years. My grandfather bought this place after returning from Korea, cleared every cedar stump himself, dug our first well with neighbors who traded labor instead of invoices, and always told me one thing whenever we fixed fences together: "Son, people will respect your land only if you respect it first." I carried those words my entire life because this wasn't just property to me. Every fence post had a story. Every pasture held memories of birthdays, funerals, branding seasons, and long summer evenings watching cattle drift through waist-high grass. Up on the ridge overlooking my ranch, though, everything had changed over the last few years. A company called Summit Crest Development bought hundreds of acres and started building one of those upscale neighborhoods filled with identical white houses, decorative stone entrances, perfectly trimmed lawns, and giant signs promising elevated living with breathtaking valley views. Folks moved there because they wanted country scenery without country life. They loved looking at my pasture from their decks, but I doubted many of them had ever stepped into a muddy field. At first, I didn't mind. New neighbors meant new business for the feed store and diner downtown. Then construction kept expanding. Roads climbed farther across the ridge, and more trucks started rolling past my gate every morning before sunrise. The man behind all of it was Ethan Holloway. He was younger than I expected the first time we met, probably early 40s. Expensive watch, perfectly pressed shirts, the kind of confidence money gives people when they've never really heard the word no. During one community meeting, he actually laughed when someone asked whether all that runoff from the new development might affect nearby farmland. He leaned back in his chair and said, "We've hired the best engineers in the state. Everything is under control." Most people nodded. I wasn't convinced. A few weeks later, I woke before daylight because my border collie wouldn't stop barking. When I drove my ATV toward the north fence, I found 3 excavators, 2 utility trucks, and half a dozen contractors already working just beyond my property line. A huge drainage pipe stretched downhill toward my pasture. I climbed off the ATV and asked the foreman what exactly they were installing. He barely looked up from his clipboard. "Storm and wastewater improvements," he answered. "Everything's permitted." "Permitted where?" I asked. "Because nobody asked me," he shrugged. Talk to Summit Crest. By that afternoon, brown water was already trickling across the lowest section of my pasture. At first, I hoped it was construction runoff, but then the smell hit. There was no mistaking it. My cattle refused to walk near the drainage ditch. Birds scattered. Even my old Labrador kept backing away from the water. I grabbed my phone, recorded everything, filled jars with water samples, and called the county environmental office before driving straight to Summit Crest's sales office. Ethan was standing outside showing a young couple around one of the model homes when I pulled in covered with mud. He smiled politely until he realized why I was there. "You need to shut that line down," I said. "You're dumping untreated sewage onto my land." He looked at my boots, then at the dirt splattered across my truck, and actually chuckled. "Mr. Mercer, do you know how much this project is worth?" "Doesn't matter. It matters to the bank, the county, and every family buying home up here." I stared at him. "You're poisoning my pasture." He stepped closer until we were almost shoulder to shoulder. "Smell that?" he asked with a grin. "That's progress." I felt my fist tighten, but I didn't move. He continued, loud enough for the buyers to hear. "Go ahead and sue me. My attorneys bill more before lunch than your ranch makes in a year." Then, as he walked back toward his truck, he deliberately stepped on one of the old cedar fence rails beside the driveway, snapping it clean in half under his boot before climbing inside and driving away without another word. I stood there holding that broken piece of cedar, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't wondering how to fix a fence. I was wondering why someone seemed so certain they could stand on my land, damage my property, dump their waste across my fields, and still believe the law was entirely on their side. The funny thing about being underestimated is that people stop hiding things from you. Ethan thought I was just another stubborn rancher who'd eventually give up after hearing enough legal threats. But he made one mistake my grandfather used to warn me about. He assumed age automatically meant ownership. It didn't. Paperwork did. The morning after our confrontation, I drove into the county recorder's office carrying nothing but a notebook, a thermos of coffee, and every property document my father had ever saved inside an old metal filing cabinet. Linda Brooks, the county records clerk, had known my family for years. She looked over her glasses when I walked in and said, "Caleb, you look like you didn't sleep." I smiled. "I need every recorded plat, survey, drainage map, and easement connected to my ranch and Summit Crest." She disappeared into the archive room and returned almost 20 minutes later carrying a faded yellow folder that looked older than both of us. She gently laid it on the counter and tapped the cover. "This one goes back to the original Carson Ranch subdivision. Before your grandfather even bought the property, the pages inside smelled like dust and history. Survey lines crossed the valley in faded blue ink, handwritten notes filled the margins, and one paragraph instantly caught my attention. Every drainage line serving the upper ridge crossed what was now my ranch through a conditional easement granted by the Mercer family decades earlier. I read it again, then a third time, slower. The easement wasn't permanent. It existed only as long as 3 conditions were continuously met. The water had to remain treated, contamination levels had to stay within state standards, and total discharge volume couldn't exceed a specific engineering limit without written approval from the landowner. Violate those conditions, and the easement could legally be terminated after proper notice. I looked up at Linda. "Has this ever been challenged?" She shook her head. "Not that I've ever seen." Suddenly, Ethan's confidence made perfect sense. Somewhere along the way, somebody assumed nobody would ever read paperwork written 40 years ago. They built an entire luxury development on that assumption. I called my attorney before I even left the parking lot. Her name was Rebecca Sloan, and unlike Ethan's expensive corporate lawyers, she grew up on a cattle ranch herself. I emailed her scanned copies of every document before I reached home. She called me back within an hour. "Caleb, if your samples confirm untreated discharge, this isn't just an environmental violation. They've already breached the easement. What do? We don't rush. We document everything." For the next 2 weeks, my ranch turned into something between a crime scene and a science project. Certified environmental inspectors collected water samples. Licensed surveyors measured flow rates. Drone footage documented the spread across my pasture. Veterinarians examined my cattle after several refused to drink from nearby troughs. Every receipt, photograph, lab report, weather record, and GPS coordinate went into organized binders Rebecca insisted might someday end up in court. Meanwhile, the situation kept getting worse. Heavy rain pushed even more waste downhill. Sections of grass began dying. One afternoon, my neighbor Hank drove over, climbed out of his pickup, and simply stood beside me looking across the damaged pasture. "That's awful," he finally muttered. "You gonna fight him?" I watched another stream of brown water crawl through the grass. "I'm not fighting him," I answered quietly. "I'm letting him make every mistake himself." Hank laughed. "Your granddad would have liked that answer." Rebecca prepared a formal notice to cure citing every easement violation, attaching laboratory reports, engineering findings, photographs, and giving Summit Crest exactly 30 days to restore compliance. We sent it by certified mail, courier delivery, and email. There would be no argument later about whether they'd received it. 3 days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was the notice, ripped cleanly in half. Across the front, someone had written one word with a black marker: "Cry." That was it. No attorney response. No engineer, no denial, just one childish word. Rebecca stared at it inside her office and slowly smiled. "Well," she said, placing it into an evidence sleeve, "sometimes opposing counsel gives you a gift." Day after day passed. Nothing changed. Construction continued. More homes were framed. More families toured model houses. Marketing banners promised luxury living above the valley while untreated sewage continued running beneath those advertisements and straight across my ranch. Ethan never called, never apologized, never inspected anything himself. Then came day 31. Rebecca filed the petition shortly after 8 that morning requesting termination of the recorded drainage easement based on documented material breach. By lunchtime, the county approved the recording. At 3:15 that afternoon, I received confirmation that the easement had officially been revoked. I drove home in complete silence. Near the edge of my north pasture stood an old steel control gate installed decades earlier where the drainage system entered my property. Most people driving by never noticed it because it looked like ordinary irrigation equipment surrounded by weeds and cedar trees. My grandfather had shown it to me once when I was 14. "Hope you never need this," he'd said while wiping grease from the wheel handle. "But never forget where it is." Standing there all those years later, I could almost hear his voice again. I checked the paperwork one last time. Rebecca had already confirmed everything. The structure sat entirely on my property. I wasn't blocking public infrastructure. I wasn't damaging anything. I was simply exercising a property right after a legally terminated agreement. I wrapped both hands around the old steel wheel and slowly began turning it. Years of rust protested with deep metallic groans as the gate gradually lowered into position. Water levels shifted almost immediately. The flow through my pasture slowed, then stopped altogether. I stood there for several long seconds, listening to nothing but wind moving through cedar branches. No celebration, no shouting, just silence. The next morning, right after sunrise, I heard tires throwing gravel outside my gate. Ethan's black SUV stopped so hard the rear end fishtailed across the driveway. He jumped out before the engine even shut off, stormed across the grass with his face bright red, and jabbed his finger toward the control gate. "Open it," he yelled. Right now, I folded my arms. "The easement no longer exists. You can't do this." "Actually," I answered, holding up a certified copy of the recorded termination. "I already did." He took one step closer. "If you don't open that gate, I'll bring in a bulldozer and tear the damn thing out myself." I looked directly into his eyes and answered as calmly as I ever have in my life. "The moment that bulldozer touches my property, this stops being a civil dispute and becomes criminal trespassing." For the first time since I'd met Ethan Holloway, he had absolutely nothing to say. The change was so gradual at first that most people living up on the ridge didn't even realize anything had happened. They woke up, poured their coffee, waved at neighbors, and drove to work exactly like every other morning, completely unaware that the legal foundation supporting their entire drainage system had disappeared the afternoon before. But engineers notice things long before homeowners do. By the end of the first day, Summit Crest maintenance crews were already opening utility access covers across the subdivision, checking flow meters, making frantic phone calls, and driving from one lift station to another with worried expressions that hadn't existed the week before. I watched most of it from my pasture through a pair of old binoculars my father used to keep in the barn. I wasn't spying because I enjoyed watching them struggle. I simply wanted to know whether anyone would finally admit they should have listened 31 days earlier. Nobody came. Nobody apologized. Nobody even knocked on my door. The second morning brought heavier pressure inside their system. Water that had always moved freely downhill now had nowhere legal to go. County engineers arrived in marked trucks before noon, followed by environmental inspectors carrying clipboards and cameras. They walked every drainage line, compared construction records against the recorded easement history, and quietly confirmed exactly what Rebecca had predicted weeks earlier. Summit Crest hadn't simply ignored my notice. They had built the next phase of an entire development while assuming they could continue using a property right that no longer legally existed. That afternoon, several homeowners began posting online about strange odors drifting through parts of the neighborhood closest to the model homes. At first, the sales office blamed unusually warm weather. Then they blamed recent rainfall. Then they claimed routine maintenance was creating temporary inconvenience. None of those explanations lasted very long because by the third day standing, water started appearing around landscaped retention areas near the newest streets. Buyers who had scheduled final walkthroughs suddenly found county inspectors parked beside beautifully staged homes with orange safety vests replacing smiling sales agents. One young couple actually drove down to my gate after hearing rumors that I had somehow set off the neighborhood. They weren't angry. They looked confused more than anything else. The husband asked politely, "Sir, are you really the reason construction stopped?" I answered honestly, "No. Construction stopped because somebody ignored the contract that allowed it to happen in the first place." He looked back toward the ridge for several seconds before quietly saying, "Nobody told us any of this." I almost felt sorry for them. They weren't responsible for what Ethan had done. They were ordinary families who trusted the people selling them a dream. The fourth day hit Summit Crest where it hurt the most: money. 4 separate purchase contracts collapsed after buyers learned the county had issued compliance investigations connected to wastewater management. So contractors began removing equipment from unfinished lots. Concrete deliveries were canceled. Framers stood around waiting for instructions that never came. Every hour construction remained frozen cost Ethan more money than my ranch earned in months. Meanwhile, my own days became strangely peaceful again. Without the constant flow of contaminated water, the ditch crossing my pasture slowly cleared. Fresh spring water diluted what remained until dragonflies and birds started returning. Hank stopped by again carrying 2 coffees and leaned against my fence while we watched a pair of calves wander back toward the restored grass. "Funny how quiet it gets," he said. "Yeah," I answered. "Turns out peace is a lot louder than people think." He laughed. "You know, the whole county's talking about you," I shrugged. "I'd rather they talked about the weather." By Friday afternoon, Rebecca called and said the words I'd been expecting all week. Their attorneys finally want a meeting. We met Monday morning inside a conference room overlooking the city. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the day Ethan laughed in front of his model homes. Back then, he'd been surrounded by employees, buyers, and confidants. Now, there were only attorneys, engineers, financial officers, and stacks of documents spread across a polished table. Ethan walked in last. His expensive suit was still tailored, but it no longer looked effortless. His shoulders sagged. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like someone who hadn't slept since the county recorded the easement termination. He sat across from me, took a slow breath, and quietly said, "Mr. Mercer, let's solve this." I looked at Rebecca before answering. "I tried solving it 31 days ago. Nobody in the room argued with that." Ethan folded his hands together. "Tell me what it'll take." I reached into my folder and slid a prepared agreement across the table. "Not payment," I said. "Protection." The room stayed silent while everyone read through the proposal. 15 years of guaranteed monthly access payments, independent laboratory testing, annual inspection rights, mandatory maintenance reporting, immediate suspension if treatment standards were ever violated again, full reimbursement for every dollar I'd already spent repairing the damage his decisions had caused. One engineer quietly whispered, "These terms are reasonable." Ethan looked up at him but didn't disagree. After several long minutes, he finally looked directly at me. "You could have asked for a lot more." I nodded. "Probably. Then why didn't you?" I thought about my grandfather. My father? The broken cedar rail still sitting inside my barn, and the smell that started this entire mess. "Because I never wanted your company," I said. "I only wanted you to respect my land the way my family always has." Ethan lowered his eyes to the contract. Without another word, he uncapped his pen and signed every page. By the time he reached the final signature line, his hand was pressing hard enough to tear straight through the paper. Nobody shook hands after the meeting. There wasn't any celebration, just quiet acceptance that this never should have happened in the first place. 2 mornings later, I drove my truck out to the old steel control gate one last time. The sunrise looked almost identical to the morning my grandfather first showed me that wheel decades earlier. I climbed down, unlocked the housing, and slowly turned the heavy handle until treated water once again began flowing through the system exactly as the original agreement intended. The difference now was simple. Every gallon was monitored. Every inspection was documented. Every obligation was enforceable. And every month, a payment arrived because somebody had finally learned that property rights aren't measured by the size of your development. They're measured by the signatures recorded long before you ever arrived. A few weeks later, I replaced the cedar fence rail Ethan had crushed beneath his boot. I could have bought a brand new treated board from the hardware store. But instead, I cut another cedar post from the back corner of the ranch the same way my grandfather always had. It wasn't about saving money. It was about remembering where this place came from. Sometimes I still see Ethan driving through the valley. He always slows down near my gate now. He never honks, never waves, never laughs. Maybe he's embarrassed. Maybe he's wiser, maybe both. As for me, every evening I still stand on the same porch overlooking the same 40 acres, listening to cattle move through the grass while the ridge catches the last light of the day. Those expensive homes still sit high above the valley. But every time I look up there, I'm reminded of something my grandfather used to say whenever rain clouds rolled across these hills. "Son, everything uphill eventually answers to what's below." Back then, I thought he was talking about water. Years later, I realized he was talking about life. So let me ask you something. If someone had dumped raw sewage across your family's land, laughed in your face, snapped your grandfather's fence with his own boot, and dared you to take him to court, would you have thought back the same way? Or would you have handled it differently? Tell me what you honestly think down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoy real stories where patience beats arrogance and paperwork proves stronger than power, make sure you subscribe, because I've got another one waiting for you.